Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. We Americans have a serious problem, an urgent problem. Donald Trump has his hands on the nuclear button. He controls the nuclear football. He has the ability to wipe out a good portion of humankind. He has the power of Armageddon. It's urgent that we yank him out of power as quickly as possible. Even Brent Baer on Fox News, the cable station that has given Donald Trump his lifeblood, said, "I think this is a really dangerous period. The period between now and January 20th. Why is it so dangerous? Because of Donald Trump and because of something else. Reality is a mass hallucination, but it's a hallucination with consequences." Wednesday night, January 6th, I was waiting to go on air on Coast to Coast, the highest rated overnight talk radio show in North America on 545 stations, the show I appear on every Wednesday at 1:06 a.m. Eastern Time. Ahead of me was Jerome Corsi, the conspiracy theorist who gave Donald Trump the idea that Barack Obama was not born in America. Corsi claimed he had been at the Capitol riots on January 6th and had seen what they were that they were led into the Capitol building by a dozen guys in full camo with ropes to escape before they could be identified. These were not Trumpists, said Corsi. They were plants, possibly from Antifa or from Black Lives Matter. I was shocked at what he said. Donald Trump had made it obvious for months that he wanted an insurrection of his followers, not of anti-Trump infiltrators. But Corsi was just one of a small army of Trump fanatics, busily fabricating a new narrative to justify the rampage of their fellow Trumpists in the Capitol building. It is a disturbing new narrative. According to this instant mythology, Donald Trump was telling the truth when he said he won in an overwhelming landslide. The election was stolen, and the guys in camo leading the Trump army into the Capitol building, as Corsi said, were not Trump supporters. They were Antifa disguised as Trumpists. They were Black Lives Matter infiltrators. They were plants put in place by the Chinese. The violence in the Capitol insurrection was a setup to make true Trumpists look bad. Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz tweeted out a Washington Times story claiming that a facial recognition company in Singapore had identified a member of Antifa and an avowed Stalinist at the Capitol Hill riot. Gaetz ignored the fact that the Washington Times on Thursday was forced to retract the story when the facial recognition company, XR Vision, said the entire tale was false. Nonetheless, mentions of Antifa on social media spiked to more than 1.5 million. Then there's another way of justifying the violence. As the New York Post, a staunch supporter of Trump, puts it, the left erupted first. The riots that accompanied some of the George Floyd demonstrations justify looting the United States Capitol. But mass hallucinations have consequences. On Parler, the MAGA faithful are calling for a new country. The United States, they say, is at war. As one MAGA Parler user put it, prepare, lock, load, and get ready to defend yourselves, patriots. The positive is that by calling for an insurrection in which a policeman's head was smashed by a Trump cultist with a fire extinguisher and killed, Donald Trump seems to have discredited himself among even Republicans. As of January 7th, 8 White House officials had resigned. 2 Trump cabinet members had quit. The Wall Street Journal had called for Trump to resign. So had unconventional Republican Lisa Murkowski. Bill Barr, Trump's super loyal Attorney General, Trump's Roy Cohen, resigned and denounced Trump's betrayal of his office. It was said that some defense and national security staffers were not resigning and were hanging in there in order to make sure that any dangerous Trump decision, like nuking Iran, could be stopped in its tracks. General John Kelly, Trump's former chief of staff, said what happened on the Capitol Hill was a direct result of Trump's poisoning the minds of people with the lies and fraud. The news staff of Fox TV has been backing away from Trump ever since the November election results came in for Biden. Newsmax, a virulently pro-Trump TV channel, confessed that the mob who broke into the Capitol was egged on by President Donald Trump. And Donald Trump himself said, in a statement posted on Twitter by his social media head, Dan Scavino, "Even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election and the facts bear me out, nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January 20th. But it's not time to rest easy. Donald Trump did not say in his statement who the orderly transition on January 20th would pass the reins of power to, Joe Biden or himself. Rudy Giuliani sees this as a war and says that the handful of Republicans who have backed away from Trump have surrendered. Rudy has called out individuals who refuse to fight for what he and Trump call election integrity, which means Trump wins. WND, a pro-Trump media outlet, says, with certification, Congress has betrayed the nation. And WND calls the certification of Joe Biden's win an evil done in the middle of the night, just like how Jesus was convicted by the Jewish high priests in the middle of the night, just like 5 states committed election fraud last November 3rd through 4th in the middle of the night. Sean Hannity said the president is right to do what he did. Newsmax's Greg Kelly compared Biden to a bank robber who got away with stealing the election. And WND went on to call the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol the best of people in the worst of times. Rush Limbaugh even celebrated the violence. He said there's a lot of people calling for the end of violence. There's a lot of conservatives on social media who say that any violence or aggression at all is unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances. I am glad, continues Limbaugh, that Sam Adams, Thomas Paine, the actual Tea Party guys, and the men at Lexington and Concord didn't feel that way. The Fox News talk show hosts who dominate the ratings, Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity, have stayed thoroughly pro-Trump. So has OAN, the radically pro-Trump TV network. As Yahoo News' Hunter Walker wrote, the Trumper one lie has become a widely accepted orthodoxy in the Republican Party, and this fact poses a grave risk to the fabric of American democracy. In fact, on Thursday, January 8th, Lynn Wood, one of the attorneys Trump has used to try to overturn the election, put up a video on YouTube titled, "We Will Still Win for More Years." And shadowy figures on the right have declared outright war with guns. In Washington, on January 20th, the day of Joe Biden's inauguration, they call it the Million Militia March. Their logo has crossed assault rifles, and their statement reads, quote, "Millions of American militia will meet in Washington on January 20th, 2021 for the purpose of preventing an attempt by the treasonous domestic enemy, Joe Biden, or any other member of the communist organized crime organization known as the Democratic Party from entering the White House belonging to we the people. In the event that justice is miraculously served and our re-elected president, Donald J. Trump, is sworn in, the president, the Capitol, and our national monuments will be protected from the proven, violent, leftist insurgents who have declared war against the United States of America and have been conducting an active insurrection in the United States of America," close quote. That is projection on a massive scale. The Trump cultists who stormed the American Capitol building on Wednesday, January 6th, as if it were the Bastille, say they were doing it to save the American Republic. But the biggest immediate danger to the American Republic right now is the delusional narcissist with no ethical compass who has control over the nuclear football and can launch a nuclear war, using, for example, Iran as an excuse. And the most pressing question of the moment is how to get that delusional narcissist out of office before he starts a world war. Look, the right has a term for Democrats like me. who have seen Trump as a danger ever since he descended on the escalator at Trump Tower and railed that Mexican immigrants are murderers and rapists. They say we have Trump derangement syndrome. But the real victims of Trump derangement syndrome are those who have entered the Trump cult. And one of the most prominent features of those in the Trump cult, and of the man they deify, is a psychological phenomenon I referred to a minute ago called projection. In projection, you vividly experience something that you cannot accept as part of yourself. Sex, violence, or anger, for example. So how do you handle being invaded by a feeling that you dare not believe is really you? You say it doesn't belong to you. It has a grip on someone else, an enemy. And you only sense it with full force in your own skull because you are training your mind on that enemy. In some cases, to obsess on him. In some cases, to defeat him. For example, when Donald Trump was running to become the Republican presidential candidate against Ted Cruz, he called Ted Lying Ted. That may or may not be true about Cruz, but Donald Trump has compiled a track record of lies unprecedented in American presidential history. The Washington Post counts more than 20,000 of those lies. Far more than that. A record-breaking tally for a leader of a democracy. When Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton for the presidency, he called his opponent Criminal Hillary. But Trump is a tax cheat and has a business operating in 30 countries. All countries that can give him what amount to bribes to win his favor. The Constitution calls bribes of this kind emoluments, and emoluments from foreign nations are grounds for impeachment. Then there's obstruction of justice, money laundering, and violations of campaign finance laws. In other words, Donald Trump is the real criminal. But that's not the only form of projection at work in the world of Trump. The Trump loyalists claim that radical Democrats want to change America from a democracy to a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship. But it is they, the Trumpists, who want to hand this nation to a man whose heroes are dictators like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. In other words, there is a real form of Trump derangement syndrome, but it doesn't belong to Democrats. It's marching at full speed through the heads of Trump's true believers. Reality is a mass hallucination. In essence, all belief systems are delusional. They are fantasies about an invisible world, fantasies that we share with our family, our friends, our subculture, our nation, or our civilization. As CNN's Marshall Cohen said in an email this week, the Capitol rioters of January 6th were incited by a big lie, that the election was stolen from Trump. Now the same liars are pushing the next big lie, that this was a false flag by Antifa. OAN, the radically pro-Trump TV channel, says in bold headlines that evidence emerges of Antifa infiltrating Capitol Hill protests. OAN also headlines that Congressman Matt Gaetz and other Republicans suggest Antifa is behind the Capitol violence. CNN's Brian Stelter reports that the naked cowboy of Times Square, who was in D.C. for the Trump march, went on Newsmax and claimed that there were people at the invasion of the Capitol dressed up as Trump supporters, and they were not Trump supporters. Once again, reality is a mass hallucination. But some hallucinations are more true than others. How can we tell which are true and which are false? By the way these delusional systems succeed or fail in giving us control over our present and our future. By the way they track with the tricks, traps, and opportunities of the real world. And by the fact that they are rooted in facts. The Trump derangement syndrome sufferers, the members of the Trump cult, are having a hard time with facts right now. They've been told that Trump won the November election in a landslide, but it was stolen from him by radical Democrats who, to repeat, want to turn America into a communist dictatorship. And they've been given detailed descriptions of the many ways that this big steal was carried out. Trump, in fact, took a good part of an hour reciting these allegations to Georgia's Attorney General in a call January 2nd. Then he repeated them again to the mobs ready to march to the Capitol. But the facts do not match the fantasies of fraud. The Trump attorneys have mounted over 60 lawsuits to overturn the election. In only a handful of them have they even alleged fraud. Why? Because they have no evidence of fraud. They have accusations that they cannot support with verifiable facts. They claim to have piles and piles of affidavits. But piles and piles of papers in the Trump world often turn out to be hoaxes. At a Wednesday, January 11, 2017 press conference, Donald Trump showed off piles and piles of paperwork that he swore were documents he had signed, giving all control over his businesses to his two sons. The British newspaper, his two older sons that is, the British newspaper, The Independent, carefully examined pictures of the folders and the edges of papers exposed within them and came to the conclusion that these heaps of pages were empty sheets. This phonying of documentation may be why 60 judges have turned down Trump cases and in some cases have bawled out the attorneys filing them. But to Trump's true believers, every instance of fraud that the Donald or his savage sock puppet, Rudy Giuliani, have railed about is real. Remember, many of the judges turning Trump down are Republicans given their judgeships under Republican presidents. In their heart of hearts, many of them want Trump to be right, but he's wrong. Then there's the biggest failure of all, Trump's 38 public statements that COVID wasn't real, that it was going to go away like a miracle, that it was a Democratic hoax, and that all headlines about COVID would cease after November 3rd, 2020. It's more than 2 months after November 3rd, and we're now approaching 400,000 COVID deaths, 6 times the number of deaths from the common flu in a year. More deaths than 5 of the wars of the 20th century combined, including World War I, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we've had more deaths by far than any other country in the world, more than England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain combined. What does that indicate about the so-called facts that Donald Trump peddles? That they are not just false, but they constitute negligent homicide. In mid-December of 2020, Donald Trump called for a mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, the day that Congress would count the votes of electors and declare Joe Biden the winner of the November election. If you believe the vote totals, and I do, Donald Trump had won the greatest number of votes for a sitting president in American history, 74 million votes. But Joe Biden had won the greatest number of votes for any American presidential candidate ever, 81 million votes, 7 million more than Donald Trump. But Trump's followers believe with absolute conviction that this is false, that it's a product of fraud. So Trump told them to shake some sense into the congresspeople and senators and to make them tell the truth on January 6th. The truth that Trump had won. And Trump let his followers know that it would be a wild time, which is Donald Trump's way of saying firearms and violence. Then on the morning of January 6th, Donald Trump addressed his gathered flock in Washington, told them to march on the Capitol building and to, quote, stop the steal. He said he would march with them. That was a lie. Trump stepped into an SUV and headed back to the White House, where he'd be safe and could watch TV. Among the crowd Trump had stoked were the right-wing bully brigade, called the Proud Boys, who pride themselves on their willingness to use violence, and followers of QAnon, the conspiracy theory that says the world is being devoured by a secret elite of child rapers and Satan worshippers that includes folks like Hillary Clinton, George Soros, and Nancy Pelosi. QAnon says that only one man, Donald Trump, can save the world. Then there was the newly elected Republican member of the West Virginia House of Delegates, Derek Evans, and a host of one of Glenn Beck's media outlets, The Blaze, shows, who tweeted that he was among what he called the revolutionaries, storming the office of Nancy Pelosi herself. Donald Trump claims that the crowd was hundreds of thousands. One right-wing newsletter that supports Trump pegged the actual crowd at as few as 1,000 people. Others say more than just 1,000. But these mere thousands somehow managed to get beyond the Capitol Police and the metal detectors. How? My guess is that there were a good many sympathizers among the policemen, Trump sympathizers. One video shows the guards removing a fence with which they had blocked the crowd. And some of those guardians of the sacred halls of democracy took selfies with the Trumpies inside the Capitol building. Then the Trumpies reportedly shat in the hallways, tracked their feces as far as they could, trashed Nancy Pelosi's office, and terrified the senators and congresswomen who hadn't been able to escape the building. Those politicians were afraid that the Trump fanatics would do something discussed on their social networks, like 4chan. Execute them. That's why many of them, hiding under their seats, were praying out loud with the chaplain. Many legislators thought these might be their last minutes on earth. Meanwhile, the American public was watching. CNN's viewership was, in the words of the news site Mediaite, truly staggering. So were viewership figures for Fox TV and MSNBC. America was glued to its TVs. What was Donald Trump's goal with all of this? Apparently to generate an insurrection, to get Antifa to respond, to start a war in the streets, and to generate an excuse to follow the advice of military men like General Michael Flynn and retired Air Force Lieutenant General and former Assistant Vice Chief of Staff Thomas McHenry, and to declare martial law, declare a state of emergency, and invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. Not to mention declaring an investigation of the election, taking all 60 failed fraud cases to military tribunals, putting off the inauguration of Joe Biden indefinitely, and leaving Donald Trump in the White House for another 4 years. And, very likely, a lot more years than that. One of the most disturbing reports to emerge from the insurrection that Trump stoked came from a tweet by Yahoo News' Hunter Walker. Wrote Walker, talking with many of the people who stormed the Capitol yesterday, I would ask them what they wanted or hoped to accomplish, and they didn't know. They just wanted Trump. It's all just Trump. The cult of Trump regards the Donald as a sacred Messiah, an anointed one, a new Jesus, a man who was a cause in himself. Adds Britain's The Independent, quote, a Jonestown massacre survivor, Yolanda Williams, has compared the rhetoric of Donald Trump to that of Jim Jones, the cult leader who orchestrated the mass murder of nearly 1,000 of his followers. You remember Jim Jones, the man who persuaded his entire cult to commit suicide by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid, all via rhetoric. The result is that, as an Associated Press headline put it, Trump's rage ignited a mob assault on democracy. The most reassuring message of all on January 7th, the day after the assault on the Capitol building, came from charismatic movement proponent, head of the Coalition of Conscience, and syndicated radio show host named Michael Brown in the pages of a radically pro-Trump publication, WND. Brown was asked if Trump has truly lost the election. What happens to all the prophecies of preachers, prophecies allegedly from God himself, that Trump would be reelected? Said Brown, it will be difficult for people to separate our faith in Jesus from our faith in Trump's reelection. No amount of factual contrary evidence will dissuade some Christian leaders. Right now, there are millions of Christians in America, including quite a few prominent leaders, who remain certain that Donald Trump will be inaugurated for a second term on January 20th. But, said Brown, he anticipates the inauguration of Joe Biden. And Biden's inauguration will not shake his faith, he says, in the least. In the current climate, that fact, that a charismatic pro-Trump Christian leader has accepted the legitimacy of Joe Biden's election, is almost breathtaking. That is a measure of how far we've come in the mass hallucination department. Is it safe to leave Donald Trump in power until January 20th? Former Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman said on CNN the day after the insurrection, "I remain concerned that the actors that we saw yesterday are increasingly emboldened. We should look at what happened yesterday as a warning. We have a very dangerous problem inside our homeland. We have ignored this domestic terrorism problem, and it is time for us to reckon with it. Reality may be a mass hallucination, but it's a hallucination with consequences." This is Howard Bloom, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, and your job and my job to protect and defend. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for that infamous, sleazy, slimy, seditious, insidious, insurrectionist little off button.